Let's speak to someone who knows about communications at number 10, Alastair Campbell, former head of comms under Tony Blair, and of course, co-host with Rory Stewart of the Rest is Politics podcast. Alastair, good morning to you.
Hi, Matt.
So when you were at number 10, the first time I met you, a long time ago, you were quite famous for your fruity language, if I may put it like that. Not short of an expletive here or there when things were going wrong. If you were in number 10 this week, in charge of comms, how would that language have sounded, coming from you?
Well, I think you've been watching too much Malcolm Tucker in the thick of it, Matt.
Are you telling me you never swore?
I did swear, and I do swear, but not on LBC.
I'm not inviting you to do that. This is a family broadcast.
Excellent. No, I would like to think that what happened this week wouldn't have happened if I'd been in Downing Street. And I mentioned the thick of it there. I think there are too many people wandering around Downing Street who somehow think if they're in there that they're like characters in the West Wing or House of Cards, and they're sort of starring in their own movies. Every single person who works in Downing Street works for the government and for the Prime Minister in particular, and they should never forget that. And so I think that one of the things that I really despised about the Johnson era, for example, is that Dominic Cummings seemed to think that he was in charge of the strategy. He was the guy who was, more important than the Prime Minister. I never, ever thought that in relation to Tony Blair. I was very controversial. I made lots of news that I didn't always want to make, but I never... Occasionally went over the top maybe, but I never did anything without understanding I'm there for the Prime Minister. And I think what seems to have happened here is that people within Downing Street have taken it upon themselves to do something which was absolutely bound to, damage the government, damage the Prime Minister, and damage, as you were saying in your previous interview with the pollster, damage this sense that Keir Starmer is going to offer serious, grown-up, stable government. So that's why I probably would have been saying a few expletives. Indeed, I was saying a few expletives under my breath as the thing was unfolding this week.
Why do you think that some very smart people at that one address were able to make such a miscalculation?
Well, listen, it wasn't a very smart thing to do. And I think maybe because some of them have not yet fully grasped that while it's always important in politics to have a campaigning mindset, government is different. And again, to go back to your previous conversation, you were making the point about, there's normally a honeymoon. One of the reasons why maybe there wasn't a honeymoon was because the first big battle that they had was over winter fuel. I would strongly have advised anybody in government, even though I think there were merits in the policy, don't make that your first big battle in government. And so what that said to me was that they came into government and maybe didn't have that coherent plan. And look, Keir Starmer has a lot of qualities. I think he's done really well on foreign policy. I think he's serious. I think he's hardworking. He's a lot of the things that some of his predecessors like Johnson and Truss were not. But I think he underestimates the extent to which in modern politics you do have to be a storyteller. You have to have a coherent, compelling narrative that people, as they're wandering about their business, just think whenever the government does touch upon them, they sort of know what the government stands for and what it's trying to do. And the worst thing about this sort of hokey-cokey over tax, and they may end up in the right position in the budget, I don't know. But the worst thing about it is that it's just sort of giving a sense of, frankly, being a bit like the last lot. And the worst thing you can be is like the last lot. They promise change, they have to deliver the change, they have to be the change and represent the change.
I mean, the budget is a bit like a sausage, isn't it? And not a very nice sausage, but you really don't want to know how that sausage is made. And I find it so unusual that, Rachel Reeves gave that speech, breakfast time speech in Downing Street a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, where she told us it was going to be really, really painful. She was preparing us all for a rise in income tax, or that's how it was interpreted. She was rolling the pitch for misery, and then she suddenly went back on that. I mean, we don't want to know how the budget is made. Just give us the bad news or the good news, if there's any, on November the 26th. And don't remind us of stuff that frightens us and makes us feel that we're hopeless and helpless.
Well, I think you're being a little bit disingenuous there, Matt, because when you say we don't want to know, the truth is that the media does want to know. And we live in a media world where it does want to see the sausage being made.
But don't feed the beast, as what I'm saying. Yeah,
Say again?
but she's feeding the media beast here.
I agree. Look, I agree. I thought what was happening when, as you say, quite an unusual event, a few weeks before the budget, with the full authority of Downing Street. She's in Downing Street behind the government lectern, and she's basically saying, in so many words, we might have to break the manifesto pledge and put your taxes up. Now, what I suspect has happened since then is either that there's been an awful lot of polling of the public going on, or there's been a report from the Office of Budget Responsibility that suggests that the economic picture is not quite as gloomy as she portrayed it at the time. However, I think that this is allied to the briefings kerfuffle and all that nonsense. This on top of it is just giving the sense of, a bit of chaos. I think the other thing which we should bear in mind is that the Office of Budget Responsibility has sort of slightly taken on a life of its own, and the gap now between a budget being announced and a budget being delivered seems to me to be far too long. We had that with the first budget as well. So you're right that people don't want to see the sausages being made, as it were, but in the media landscape that we have, and in this very, very febrile political world, made more so by other things, by Trump, by social media, by the fact of war, all these things that sort of crowd in on a prime minister and on a government, the most important thing is constantly to be giving a sense of where you are trying to take the country towards. And that, I think the budget is a very, very important marker for that. But there's no point denying, when you look at the ratings that you said, even though I think they're unfair, I don't think Keir Starmer's, I would hesitate to say he deserves worse poll ratings than Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. It's ridiculous on one level, but that's the world we're in. And the only way to deal with that is to govern better, to make people feel that you completely understand where they're coming from in terms of their concerns about the future, and address those concerns.
And of course, one of those issues, which is also an issue of engagement, is with young voters. Now, I'm always struck, as I think you've been as well, that young voters increasingly are turning towards parties on the populist right or the populist left. That's definitely the case in France, where the kind of mainstay of support for Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National is actually amongst younger voters, not just the old, the crusty old nostalgics for, a time when France was still, owned Algeria and all these sort of things. In Germany, the AfD has got a huge amount of support amongst the young voters, especially young men. Same thing, I think, is happening with Reform UK. In America, where I am at the moment, Trumpland thrives on young male voters, although they're turning away to some extent from Trump. We'll discuss that in the 11 o'clock hour. So how does a party that has been around for as long as the Labour Party engage with young voters in an open and meaningful way, and giving, being honest and transparent about the process of government without getting hopelessly lost, in the forest?
Well, that's a great question. It's one that, given that this government, one of the things I applaud the government for is that they're reducing the voting age. I've been campaigning for that for years. But given it's happening in this febrile atmosphere, and given it is not being accompanied by a boosting of political education and political citizenship and empowerment, I actually worry about it now. I'm still glad that it's happening, but I do worry. And interestingly, Rory Stewart and I talked on the podcast this week about a very interesting report that my former colleague in Number 10, Peter Hyman, has written, with a young black guy, Peter, sort of middle-aged, middle-class white guy who's worked at the centre of government, been a head teacher. He's been touring the country with this young guy, and they've been talking to thousands of teenagers. And actually, if you get the New World, this newspaper this week, they've done a huge piece on this, and the headline is what goes on inside the mind of a teenager. And the thing is that we sort of have a sense of what they think, but actually, when you talk to them themselves, the reason why they are partly attracted, say, to a Farage, or now on the left, much more to a Zach Polanski, is because of the clarity with which they speak. The reason why a lot of young men around the world are more attracted, say, to a Donald Trump than they should be, given he's a liar and a felon and all this stuff, is because there's something engaging and amusing and absolutely direct about him. Interestingly, though, Matt, what this report finds is that you mentioned the sort of grumpy old men who we know kind of quite like the Brexit Party and all this stuff. A lot of these young people, they actually have much more informed opinions of politics, because they're not just sitting there consuming one newspaper or consuming one GB News television station, or dare I say, listening to one radio station. They're being bombarded by stuff, and they're much more savvy about how to think it through. But I think what is the problem at the moment, just to give you one problem, Nigel Farage has more TikTok followers than every other member of Parliament combined. That's because he's worked at it. And I think that the Labour Party and the government communications is very much trapped in the old world that I was in, which was basically, brief the newspapers, get on the telly, do the odd phone in. The most important thing is to have the strategic message that all of your MPs and all of your ministers and all of your party members feel comfortable about, confident in, and go out and sell. Young people want to see confidence, they want to see clarity, and they want to see strength. And where you're absolutely right, and this is particularly the case in some of the European countries you mentioned, the decile of the population in every continent in the world at the moment that is most attracted to authoritarian leadership is not the old, it's the young. That is a real challenge for politicians who want to try to keep this country on the right track.
I mean, the only politician in France who appeared amongst, the 50 most influential people in the country was Jordan Bardella, the 30-year-old current head of the Rassemblement National, who, if Marine Le Pen, is not allowed to run for the election next year, or the year after, may well become the next president of France. I mean, this sort of youthful engagement, I just wonder whether the big parties that have been around for so long, especially in our system, which preserves big parties because of the first-past-the-post electoral system, I wonder if those big parties are still fit for purpose.
Well, they're certainly struggling. There's no doubt about that. We're seeing that across Europe. But what's different about our country is that we have a political system that essentially is designed for two-party politics, and we're now in multi-party politics. What's happened in some of the European countries you talk about, Germany, the Netherlands, some of the Scandinavian countries, is that they have a political system that is essentially designed for multi-party politics. And I think the other thing that we've got to understand is that I was saying this on the podcast the other day, that Gordon Brown became Prime Minister in the same week that Steve Jobs announced the invention of the iPhone. Okay? Since the iPhone was invented in 2007, we've had 7 prime ministers. The previous 7 prime ministers before the iPhone was invented, they lasted between them 43 years. Social media, the technological change, it has sped up everything. And what I think Keir Starmer will be worrying about is the fact that I think one of the reasons people voted for Labour in the way that they did, obviously I think the main reason was to get rid of the Tories, but one of the reasons was because this approach he had that we're going to let politics tread more lightly on your lives. I'm afraid politics at the moment is kind of in people's face all the time. You have to be in that mix all the time. I despise Donald Trump and a lot of what he stands for, pretty much everything he stands for. But if I were Labour, I would be learning a few things from the way that he communicates. He's always in the conversation. He's always in the space. You always know what he sort of stands for, even if you don't like it. And I think there's something about Labour's communications and the Conservatives' communications and actually Reform. I mean, the truth is, I don't think Reform are very good at this stuff. It's just that on the TikTok side of things, Farage is better than the others.
Right. Final 2 brief questions, brief answers, if you don't mind. Is Labour going to have to give up a scalp over the briefing chaos this week? And when do you expect a leadership challenge against Keir Starmer?
Well, I mean, the honest answer, you want a short answer, the answer to both is I don't know. I think that it's impossible to imagine a situation where your poll ratings are as they are now, and there isn't inevitably chatter, and the chatter that has surrounded these previous 5 prime ministers under the Tories. The point is, Keir Starmer has to get a grip of his operation. Up to him who stays and who goes, but he's got to get a grip of that, make them all understand they work for him, not for themselves. And that for the longer term, Labour has got to give a sense that the plans that they brought forward, on which they were elected, they've got a big majority, they're going to see them through.